I think we are live. It's telling us live and video is starting. Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Facebook Live with Prof. Noakes for the year 2024. So, Happy New Year to you, Prof.
Thank you, Johanna, to you and to all listeners.
We're very excited to have you all here with us again. If it is your first time joining a live with us, you are welcome to post any questions or comments that you might have for Professor Noakes in the comments section. And if you are joining us and been with us before, please just tell us hello and where you are from. It's always lovely to hear from you all. So before we dive into the questions, I just want to make two announcements. And the first one is just to remind everyone that we are so excited that this year the Noakes Foundation is 10 years old. It's an incredible achievement. And to celebrate this, we will be hosting a fundraiser on the 18th of April. And we want to invite all of you to join us there. You can check the announcement box at the top of this video for more information on how to secure your tickets. And then something else that's very exciting is that the Nutrition Network is launching their new cancer module today. And Prof, I actually want to invite you to maybe just speak a little bit more about this module and the importance of it.
Well, indeed, and obviously I'm not a cancer expert, but I was fortunate to contribute to the textbook about this, a chapter on how cancer is a novel disease. It didn't exist in populations before we changed our diet so radically with the introduction of highly refined, ultra-processed foods. So the one suggestion might be that nutrition is a key driver of cancer. And that's not something that is widely taught. Certainly it's not something I was taught at medical school. And I doubt that it is taught today. Cancer is a major business, as people understand, and that has caused alternative treatments to be suppressed. And the possibility that nutrition might be important has been excluded from the conventional treatment. So what I'm excited about the course is that it offers alternatives to conventional treatment. I'm not saying that anyone must stop their conventional treatment, but it's very clear that there are alternatives and some are highly effective. And again, the argument that they've been suppressed because they are effective. And certainly having read the program and gone through its lectures, there are so many options for people who have cancer that to simply go down the one route and not to consider fasting and a low carbohydrate, high fat diet and a range of other treatments would be stupid. I was at a lecture the other night and the lady got up, and she's a very, very well-known lawyer in South Africa with a wide following. She's alternative, and so in other words, she sort of fits in more into what we teach. She developed leukemia at a young age. She was treated conventionally, eventually said, I've had enough. It was too painful, the treatment. And she went and researched her own treatments. And 20 years later, she's alive with children. And that's a miracle because the conventional treatment failed and she used unconventional treatments. So if there's one message from this, it is that don't stick with the conventional cancer treatments. There are many other options. Ironically, one of the treatments is ivermectin, which of course they tried to ban from COVID. But that has some role also in cancer, and there are many others as well. So that's the first point that I'd like to talk about, and I'm sure, Jana, you'd allow me to speak a little bit more about other things. So,
yes, of course, Prof.
So I think all of you know that I'm working with Philip Prince and his team in Pennsylvania, Garden City College, and we've done a number of studies of low carbohydrate diets and athletic performance, and we finally came to what we considered would be the final test. And so we've fortunately just completed the study, and we're writing it up, and I've got the results, and they are spectacular. They are, when we planned, we had this hypothesis, and when we planned it, we said, well, it's going to prove one way or the other what the outcome will be, and it fell on our side, or I'm glad to say. So the argument is that when you take carbohydrates before exercise, they pump up your muscle glycogen stores, and that's why you perform better And if you don't pump up the muscle glycogen stores, you run out of glycogen and you stop exercising early. That's the one more popular model. The other model is that actually it's got nothing to do with muscle glycogen. It's related to your blood glucose. And once your blood glucose level starts to fall, then you stop exercising. So we said, okay, why don't we manipulate both? We manipulate the muscle glycogen and we manipulate the blood glucose concentration. So we had a group of athletes, the same 10 athletes, and for 6 weeks they ate a low carbohydrate diet, and then they converted to the high carbohydrate diet, and then we tested them on a bicycle. They cycled for as long as they could, and they did it once, obviously on the low carb diet, once on the high fat diet, once on the low carb diet when they ingested carbohydrate, because that's going to influence the blood glucose level, and once when they had a placebo. So we were manipulating both muscle glycogen and the blood glucose. Now, if it's all muscle glycogen, then the first thing you'll find is that the people with the high glycogen will exercise for longer, and the carbohydrate ingestion may or may not make any difference. But if it's related to the blood glucose level, not the muscle glycogen level, then the loading up with carbohydrates will make no difference. So the performance will be identical regardless of the pre-exercise diet. But if the blood glucose is important, what they drink, those who drink glucose during exercise, their performance will be better than when they ingest placebo. So that's a beautiful model because it distinguishes between what carbohydrate is essential. Is it the muscle or is it the blood glucose? What's important is that the blood glucose is a tiny amount. It's 5 grams or so. It's tiny. Whereas the amount of the blood in the muscle is like 400 or 500 grams. So we call that the small glucose pool, which is the blood glucose, and the large glucose pool, which is the muscle glycogen. And I'm glad to say what we found was that the large glycogen pool made zero difference to performance. So it didn't matter whether you started with lots of glycogen or little glycogen, the performance was identical. So that tells us muscle glycogen is not essential, which is what we've taught and I've taught for hundreds of years. But as soon as we gave them carbohydrates, whether they were on the low carb or the high carb diet, they performed better. So that tells us that what's regulating exercise performance is not muscle glycogen, it's the blood glucose. That's the small glucose amount. So that's absolutely novel, and it's a seminal finding because it says when you exercise, you don't have to worry about your muscle glycogen stores, but you have to worry about your blood glucose. And that requires very little glucose ingestion during exercise. And it's important that this should come out now because there's this huge pressure on athletes to drink 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour, where we show that 10 grams an hour is all you need. So that's the difference. And drinking 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour is very toxic for your body, in my opinion. And if we can get people to use the minimum amount, then we've helped them. So that's the story. So it's quite exciting. It should be published, I guess, in about 3 months' time. Whether it will be ignored completely or not, I don't know. We'll see that.
Wow, Prof, that's very exciting. So I've got a question then.
Yes.
So let's say you follow a low carb or keto diet. Would it then be of benefit for you to take carbohydrates or something while you do your exercise
Only
or
if
when you compete?
Yeah, only if you're exercising 2 or 3 hours for 2 or 3
Okay.
hours now. Yeah, then. And my great friend Daniel Plews, who's from New Zealand, who is a world-class triathlete at age 40, he holds the world record for the Ironman at his age.
Wow.
And he's been low carbs for a long time. And what he does is he just has his athletes on low carb diets, measure their blood glucose levels, and continuously during exercise, and sees how long they can go before the blood glucose level falls. Once it starts falling, your performance will be impaired. And so if they can do 2 hours without their blood glucose level falling, he says, well, you don't need carbs. And so that's the reality. You can, for most people, 2 or 3 hours is not a problem. But 5 or 6 hours might be a problem.
Thank you, Prof. That's really interesting. Wow. Let's quickly have a look here and see who is joining us. So John is saying hi from Adelaide, Australia. Janice saying hi from Illinois. Always nice to have you here. Also Glasse, Brooks, Good morning from Brazil, Prof and Kiana. I see he's saying, they were saying going to work and watch later, but they sent a question already. We'll get to it shortly. Yeah, so many people joining us, the team from the Noakes Foundation, the team from Nutrition Network. Kim is saying hi from Melbourne. So thank you everyone for joining us, and you are welcome to shoot us with those questions. So Prof, we actually already got a few questions lined up from people that sent it in prior to the live. So I think I'm going to start with them. And the first question is from Ursula, and they're asking your view on metformin, please. I'm insulin resistant.
Yeah, Ursula, so I'm on metformin. I have been on metformin for about 12 years now. And it's a pretty safe drug. There are some suggestions that you don't adapt to exercise training quite as well if you're on metformin. But if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, I think it's more important to control your blood glucose levels. So I'm very positive about metformin to get your blood glucose in the normal range if otherwise you struggle. And that's typically my case. So I've reversed my type 2 diabetes, but I can't keep my blood glucose below 6 unless I use metformin. And then I can keep it in the low 5s. So that's why I use it. And I just think that little bit of extra is important. So I don't think for anti-aging, I'm not sure that's correct. I don't know. We just don't have the data. You'd have to judge that for yourself. But if you have a condition that is linked to deterioration because your glucose is elevated, then I think metformin is a safe alternative. It's better than allowing your blood glucose level to remain elevated. So I'm very positive on metformin, with the proviso that I think you have to be diabetic or pre-diabetic to use it. I'm not convinced that we have the data on if you're healthy, whether you should take it or not. And it may well work, it may be helpful, but as a scientist, one can't advocate it because we don't have the data yet.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. The next question is from Matt. What is the answer of Prof. Noakes to the recent findings of Landon or Eandon, not sure which one? Our study found that regular consumption of a self-reported diet low in carbohydrates and high in fat was associated with increased levels of LDL cholesterol or bad cholesterol and a higher risk of heart disease.
So those are classic retrospective studies, and that's the problem in science, that the science that we can vouch for is where you have randomized control trials, where you have a control group and you intervene and you make the group that you're interested in, they have to change something. Doing retrospective studies on self-reported data is open to all sorts of problems. And what's happened over the last 30 years is that Harvard Medical School, and particularly Dr. Walter Willett, has become the most published scientist in the world. So, and what he's done is done retrospective studies where they start with a population from Boston, nurses and doctors particularly, and 40 years ago they had a complete analysis of their diets, and then 40 years later they see who died from what, and then they try to relate that back to what they reported that they ate during those 40 years. But they didn't monitor them daily. They didn't have a measurement. It was reported. And those data are pretty dicey. And the problem is that they don't have enough difference in the diets. So when they talk about a low carbohydrate diet, it's not a low carbohydrate diet. It's a diet which has less than 45% carbohydrate. That's not a low carbohydrate diet. So they don't get the extremes that we think you need, where you've got a 5% carbohydrate diet, for example, versus a 50 or 60 or 70% carbohydrate diet. That's point one. And point two is people who eat different diets do so for many reasons. And there's a suggestion that if 40 years ago, the idea was that you should eat cereals and grains. So the healthy people started eating cereals and grains, and they didn't smoke, and they did lots of exercise, and they generally looked after themselves. Whereas maybe the people eating meat or eating more fat weren't quite as careful about their health. But you can't detect that, or if you do detect it, they correct for it, which sounds ridiculous. So in summary, the only way you can prove a diet's good or bad is on a prospective study where you look going forward and you change the diet. We can't do that anymore. So it's difficult to prove that a particular diet is more beneficial than another diet. The beauty of the low carbohydrate diet is that it causes weight loss and it corrects all your variables except the cholesterol. The LDL cholesterol may well go up, and the thinner you are, the more the LDL cholesterol goes up. And that's the hyper responders, the lean people who hyper respond. And I was watching a video from Sean Baker, who's a carnivore and is a world-class athlete, a rower at 50 plus. His mother is a South African, just by the way. He managed to change his cholesterol in the units, American units, from 300 to 150 in 15 hours, just by fasting and exercise. So what he's trying to show is you get this random changes, and if he's measured when he's 300, they'll say, well, you're going to die tomorrow. Whereas at 150, they'd say you're going to live forever. But that's 15 hours difference in the testing. So I just like to emphasize that cholesterol has never been shown to be a major risk factor for heart disease and ill health. Diabetes is. It's diabetes, diabetes, diabetes. And so if you want to know if the diet's helping you, it must reverse or prevent you getting type 2 diabetes. That's the diet to eat. And what it does to your cholesterol is much less important. It's what it does to your insulin and glucose 24 hours a day. That's what is important. And I'll just remind you that our last study with Philip Prince, we also measured blood glucose levels in these athletes when they ate the high-fat diet or the high-carbohydrate diet. We've repeated it now in this most recent study. I haven't seen the results yet. But in the previous study, 30% of the athletes were pre-diabetic eating the high-carbohydrate diet, and they're completely unaware. Now, this was when they were training, they were relatively lean, and they didn't put on weight during the trial. When we converted to the low-carbohydrate diet, they didn't lose weight, they didn't eat fewer calories, they didn't do more exercise, and guess what? Their diabetes disappeared. So that's the first definitive proof that it's the carbohydrate content in these athletes that was driving their pre-diabetes. And that's, again, that will be ignored until we get more data, but we will over time get more data. So it's the diabetes that you have to worry about, not the level of your cholesterol.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. The next question is from Linda. Hi, Prof. What's the best course you'd recommend for someone without any formal dietetics training who is wanting to go into the field, but specifically to work in low-carb, keto, and carnivore? Is it sufficient to do the LCHF practitioner training to get started? And can you build from there through the nutrition network? Or is one still required to take a conventional route with a degree that teaches low-fat cholesterol is the devil, and then just ignore all of that once qualified? This is for someone in their late 30s, so the fastest track is preferred.
Yeah, Linda, that's a great question. Because if you just do the nutrition network, which I think you should do anyway, it's not going to give you a qualification registered with the Medical and Dental Council anywhere. So you won't be able to charge for your services beyond what people are prepared to pay for your consultation as an expert, but not as a registered expert. And that's the challenge. If you go to medical conventional dietetic school, you're going to be taught all the wrong stuff. And you then become part of the system, or you have to be part of the system. How you break out of the system, I don't know, because it's very similar for doctors to break out of the conventional medical training, and the way we treat patients is extremely difficult. And the bit more successful you become, you just become cancelled. So there may be other people watching this who've had experience and know exactly the way to go. My advice would be to do, obviously, the Nutrition Network program, because then at least you'll know what's true. If you then want to go, if at the same time you want to do conventional training, you should do it and see what happens. But there's no guarantee that you will be able to practice as a dietitian doing what you want to do. That's the difficulty. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Linda, for that question. The next one is from Alison. My husband, Brian, who is 61, is lean and fit, has been eating LCHF for 2 years, has a 0 coronary calcium score, and all of his blood markers are in the healthy range. He gets blood nose very often, sometimes every day for weeks on end. He eats a lot of fish. He has canned salmon for lunch, Monday to Friday, and oily fish 2 to 3 times per week for dinner. Do you think his fish consumption could be contributing to his nosebleeds? I've been encouraging him to make an appointment with his GP, but that hasn't happened yet.
That's really interesting, Alison, because I forget the guy's name, but there was a chap at Oxford who went and looked at the Eskimo or the Inuit and found that they had a tendency for bleeding, and it was completely related to fish oil intakes. So I suspect you're right in drawing those conclusions. And I'll try to remember his name. He was vilified actually for promoting this, because here they were eating saturated or not the conventional fat, the vegetable oils, which were being promoted. And he had a tough time promoting his ideas until ultimately it was realized that he was correct. So I think that you might well consider this as a possibility, and you might get some of the blood tests for screening for clotting and see what's going on. But I suspect your husband's just going to have to cope with his nosebleeds. I don't think he's going to change his diet. And generally, the bleeding tendency is probably not that important, provided he doesn't bleed within one of the big arteries like in the brain or something like that. But he's been doing this for a long time, and so far he's got away with it. I really appreciate the fact that he's got a 0 coronary artery calcium score. That's amazing. So he's got 0 coronary artery disease, so the diet's doing him extremely well. And this is a side effect of the diet, but it's not considered to be a particularly dangerous side effect.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for that very interesting question. I feel like that's a very interesting fact about what you mentioned about the Inuits and the Eskimos.
Yeah. Let me just see if I can get the guy's name. I'm just going to check the internet. I'll work away and see if I can find what his name was.
Shall I go on to the next question,
Yeah,
Solo?
Yeah.
So, Ikes is asking, how does one get off glucophage, etc., if diagnosed recently as a type 2 diabetic? What would be the step-by-step approach?
And the person's name was?
Ikes. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Okay, Ikes. Well, so you've obviously been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, so you've got an elevated fasting blood glucose level, or you maybe had a glucose tolerance test, which showed that you have too high glucose and maybe too high in insulin. So that's the diagnosis, and what should happen thereafter is you should be put on a low carbohydrate diet immediately. And that low carbohydrate diet should be down to 50 or 25 grams of carbohydrate a day. And that will do an enormous amount to regulate your blood glucose level. If it's not completely effective, then you should take glucophage as well. So you should get your fasting glucose below about 5.6, 5.7, and your insulin down below 2 or 3 units. Then the diet is doing all it can do. Can't do any more than that. And if you do the diet, 25 to 50 grams of carbs a day, and you don't get to that range of values, then you may well need to eat glucophage as well. So what I'm offering you is a low carbohydrate diet, and see what happens. If you manage to get your glucose down to those levels that I've mentioned, then you can stop the glucophage. But if you don't get them down to those levels, then you probably should continue with glucophage. However, if you stop taking glucophage and your blood glucose levels rise again above 6 fasting glucose, then I think you should go back on them. And again, my point is that it's one of the safest drugs known to humans. It is linked to a reduced cancer rate. Again, this is not intervention. These are not randomized control trials. But if you look at people taking metformin or glucophage versus those not taking it, those taking it have a lower rate of certain cancers. So it's not, may not be causal, but at least it's not the opposite. It's not showing increased cancer rates. And again, the only negative consequence of glucophage is for athletes, healthy athletes who are on glucophage. They tend not to be quite as strong as those who aren't. So there's some suggestion that it blocks your adaptation to training. But the effect is probably very, very small and can probably be overridden by doing more training or eating more protein.
Thank you, Prof. That's so interesting. I just want to scroll up here because I see a few more people joined us. So I just want to say hi to everyone. So let me just see where we were. There we were there, and then I see here we said hi to Kim, and then Sabrina from the Nutrition Network is tuning in from Cape Town. Then Dave is saying hi, Prof. Long time no see. Missed our little go live years ago. Just finished my meetings with your team a while ago. Amazing. Erez is saying hi. So many people that's joining us. Christine, all the way from Norway. Hi, Christine. Ed from watching from Covada from the Philippines. Wow, so we literally have people from all over. It's so exciting to have you all here with us. Prof, the next question, which is, I'm looking forward to your answer to this, is from Anthony. And he's asking, why are there so many diametrically opposed views on nutrition?
You know, I'm always cautious because I'm called a conspiracy theorist and so on and so forth. But the reality is, and I've been tweeting on this recently, is that the training that doctors get and the training that dietitians get is completely controlled by two forces. And they're commercial forces, and that's big food and big pharma. And that's the reality. They have captured education. And, that's why I went to court to, in a sense, show that I was up against the experts in nutrition and in cardiovascular disease, and they were utterly hopeless. They absolutely don't know how to present data. And they don't really care about the data because they know it and they've got all the support, so they never have to question. So the diametrically opposite arguments begin with Ansel Keys in the 1950s, and he comes along and makes it. So let me step back. In the 1940s, during the Second World War, Ansel Keys did this astonishing study of fasting. He starved groups to see what would happen when they got refed. Because what was happening in Europe was that the Europeans were starving because of the Second World War, and he wanted to know, how do you cope with starvation, and how would you refeed these people to get them healthy again? And he had these military conscripts who refused to fight the war, but they were happy to do his experiments. And he did these experiments which would be completely unethical today. And he starved these guys, and they all had psychiatric problems. And they were eating 1,500 calories a day of energy. So it shows that if you eat male and you're eating 1,500 calories a day and you're restricting your diet and it's high in carbs, you're going to probably get psychiatric or psychological problems. Anyway, at the end of the war, what happened next was that the Americans decided their president had died from hypertension. That was, I'll think back again which one it was, Roosevelt. Roosevelt died from a stroke caused by hypertension, which was in 1945. And it's critically embarrassing because the Americans didn't know how to treat their own president. So the next president, Truman, came along and said, okay, we're going to sort out heart disease. And he formed the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. And that became the first investment in science, medical science. And so they started tackling heart disease, and Keyes realized this was a great opportunity. And so he literally saw a graph published by the World Health Organization showing the fat intake in different countries, in 24, 26 countries. And he noticed that if he knocked out 18 and just left 6 behind, he got a nice straight line relationship between how much saturated fat was in the diet and the mortality from heart disease in those countries. And Japan was the bottom country, and America was the top country for heart disease and fat intake, and then there were 4 other countries in between. So he selected it, and then that graph was published as proof. And that's just an association. And the association was very weak and could be explained by many other factors. But anyway, that became the goal. The American Heart Association bought into this idea that saturated fat was killing, and in 1961, the American Heart Association was funded by the vegetable oil industry, and they started promoting vegetable oils as better than saturated fat. And that then took the American Heart Association to another level, and then they got all sorts of funding, and they'd committed to this idea that saturated fat was dangerous. They couldn't back down. And they still haven't backed down. So that's how powerful the control is. So then the dietitians came along, and the Dietetics Associations actually only started being formed late on the 1960s, 1970s. And they come along at this time that saturated fat's the killer. And so that's what they taught. And it's not changed. And I went to court on this one for 4 years. We didn't change one thing. The people that we defeated are still teaching exactly the same thing. So to answer your question very simply, big food and big pharma control what is taught in medical school. And what's taught in medical school is not to make you healthy. That's why we have a nutrition network and we have the Noakes Foundation. Because it's not designed to make you healthy, it's designed to make you sick. And the more sicker you are, the more the profits that the big pharma can make. So that's the tragedy. People believe that they go for medical care to get healthy. You don't. Medicine is not about health. It's got nothing to do with health. We speak about health, and we have to do it clandestinely in this way, from this place. Don't know where we are because you might come and put us in jail if you found out where we were. So that's the point, that is the clandestine people like the Noakes Foundation who are telling you the truth. And we want to make you healthy. And that's the reality. Your job is to look after your own health, because once you get in the clutches of medicine, you're going to become progressively less healthy. And I could go on for another hour, but we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. On our website, under blog, there's actually 2 series that was written by Prof on this topic of Ansel Keys. The one is called, it's the Insulin Resistance Stupid, and the other one is called Ansel Keys Cholesterol Con. So I'm going to ask the media team, they can just pop the link to those also here in the chat. I'm not sure, but there's quite a few parts to each series. I think it goes up to part 13 or 14. So if you're interested to learn more about that, then you can go and have a read there. Then the next question that I have here is from Adrian. So she's saying, I'm completely antibiotic resistant. Over and above shielding up, cleanliness, and other old age methods, can I utilize honey, wax? Oh, and I utilize honey, wax, and cabbage, and has not helped. Fasting is not working.
Sorry, so you said you are antibiotic resistant. So I'm not quite sure what that means. In other words, you get infections that are resistant to antibiotics. Okay, so the great other conspiracy theory is that the germ theory is which you're proposing, that we get affected by germs, which we then use antibiotics to treat. That's the one model, that's the germ model, and that was developed by Pasteur in the 1880s. And Pasteur was criminally fraudulent. I mean, it's astonishing. The best book to read is a book called Becham, Bechamp, or Pasteur. And it says it's something like a lost chapter in the history of medicine. So Pasteur stole Becham's ideas and claimed they were his own. Then he got heavily involved in vaccination and was completely ruthless in his experiments. And you must remember, science wasn't so great in the 1860s. We didn't know about randomized controlled trials. They didn't measure things so carefully. And Pasteur developed a whole lot of vaccines which were highly ineffective, and they killed a lot of people. I mean, the best experiment was his anthrax vaccine, which he then used in sheep. And he killed 60 to 80% of the sheep with his vaccine. It was astonishing. And then he claimed it's a success. His rabies vaccine was a similar, that it was less effective. He killed more people than were saved by the vaccine. But that was never properly reported. So Pasteur is remembered as the man who developed the germ theory, and that's the one we follow. Now, Becham, in contrast, said this was his theory, and understand this is a theory. I'm not saying it's true. I'm just telling you what Becham said and what he presented evidence for. One of the first things that really influenced him was that he had a microscope, and microscopes weren't widely used in biology in those days. And he got samples of lime, which had been in the earth for hundreds of millions of years. And he extracted the lime, and he found little moving things. So he found live things in the lime, and the lime's been dead for hundreds of millions of years. And that interested him. And he called those things microzymes. And then he found microzymes in anything living has a microzymes. And the microzymes, he says, is the basis of life. The cell, which we normally say is the basis for life, he said, no, it's microzymes, which are a small integral part of the cell, but they never die. So when you die, everything dies, your cells die, but the microzymes remain. Now, okay, so that's the one part of the theory, but the second part of the theory is much more difficult to believe. This is where it really becomes difficult. What he claims he showed was that when people get sick, the microzymes start to change, and they change into bacteria. And so when you have a bacterial infection, it's not coming from outside, it's coming from inside. And that's the terrain theory. Is the terrain theory correct or not? Who knows? But we, on the Nutrition Network, we give you both sides of the argument. And if you're finding you're antibiotic resistant, what it might mean is that your terrain is unhappy and it wants to be sick frequently. And to get your terrain healthier, you need to look at a whole range of things. So I was speaking about this a few nights ago, and they said, you've got to look at your light source. You've got to look at this terrible thing, the cell phone. You've got to look at your computer and the electricity that it's producing. And people say you must shut down your network at night and you mustn't sleep near it. And all this electricity that's going on needs to be taken out. So the terrain theory says there are many factors other than a germ getting into your body that impact your health. And so that's what we try to promote. It may be wrong, it may be right, but there's nothing wrong with trying to make yourself healthier by building up your terrain and avoiding all these other factors that are in your environment, like poisons, like fluoride, and all sorts of things, which might be poisoning you and causing your body to want to get rid of these microzymes, and that makes you feel sick.
That is really interesting, Prof. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for that question. The next, I want to ask a question, a small comment from Glauce. They're saying, spent Christmas with my mother-in-law in England, and she was baffled by my diet. She really couldn't understand my new way of eating. In the end, I had to adapt a little and consequently fell off the wagon. Please give me a slap on the wrist, Prof. I've put on 4 kilos.
Yeah, so You know, what I didn't know when I started this journey in 2011 was the role of sugar addiction in this whole problem. And thanks to the great lecturers we have on the Nutrition Network, they've definitely taught me, like Bitten Johnson. She's been amazing in showing us. So she had various addictions, and she would then cope with the addiction and reversed it. And the same with Corin Thompson, who organized our first low carb meeting in South Africa, or conference in South Africa. They both had other addictions, and they recognized sugar was even the worst addiction you can probably have. So your problem is simply that when you say you've fallen off the wagon, it's absolutely right. You've fallen off the no sugar wagon. And that's what you have to get. You have to understand that the sugar in processed foods and in sports drinks and in Coca-Colas and so on, and adding sugar to your drinks is the problem. And you have to go cold turkey again. You have to stop the sugar, woof, and you'll be fine. As soon as you get the sugar out of your system for a couple of months, you'll be fine again. So that's the problem. It is so addictive, and it's so under-recognized. And why is it under-recognized? Because industry wants you sick, and they designed foods to make you get a sugar addiction and get unhealthy. And of course, they're going to prevent anyone saying that. So that's why you'll hear it here and nowhere else.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Klaus, for sharing that with us. The next question is from NP. Good morning from Michigan, USA. Do you feel that carnivore type eating is supportive of someone doing CrossFit 4 to 5 times a week, or should I stick to a more ketogenic level eating? I'm a nurse practitioner and love the textbook.
Thank you very much. That's lovely. So I must tell you my little story of Michigan. So I went to Ohio State recently for a conference and we went around the Ohio State football emporium, which is just one of the most astonishing facilities I've ever seen in my life. And there was a clock which had a countdown. And let's say it was 3 weeks, so many hours and so many minutes. And that was for the game between Ohio State and the University of Michigan. And in that facility, you were not allowed to mention the word Michigan. We do not mention Michigan. So I don't know what happened in the football season that's just ended and whether your Michigan came out on top of Ohio State. But whenever I hear the word Michigan, I remember that lovely story. So to answer your question again, if you are into CrossFit and eating a high-fat diet, that's the best solution for health that I know about. It's amazing. You do not need carbohydrates for exercise performance, except if you run for more than 4 or 5 hours. You need a tiny amount of carbohydrate because your liver capacity to produce glucose is usually not quite enough to provide the glucose that you need, that your brain needs, I should say, when you exercise for 4 or 5 hours. But up to 2 or 3 hours, you really don't need carbohydrates. And the more carbohydrates you eat, the more visceral obesity you have. And that you can't detect. And what amazes me is that we have these world-class athletes eating high carbohydrate diets in sports like cycling, which are very, very dependent on weight. And they don't yet get the connection between the high carb diet and the visceral obesity. So once you go on a carnivore diet, you're going to lose 1 to 2 kilograms of visceral fat. And you'll put on a kilogram of muscle, which therefore you might think your diet, your body composition hasn't changed, but it has changed. One of the people who drew my attention to this was a former captain of the Australian rugby team. And he came to South Africa and we chatted about his diet. And he said that he had the most magnificent build that I've ever seen on any rugby player. And when he converted to the low-carb diet, he said, I put on an extra kilogram of muscle and lost a kilogram of fat. And that was dramatic for someone who's trained so hard. So that's what you need to remember. The visceral obesity is something that's not recognized.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. The next question from Janice. what level of fasting insulin, um, when and how can I get my doctor to order the test? So I think she's asking what is the optimal level for your fasting insulin and how can she get her doctor to order the specific test for her?
So the South African units are, it's international units per ml or liter, I'm not quite sure. But the value is, it's 2 to 6. That's the value, the range that you need. But they allow you to have a value of 10 or 20. That's the normal range. And that is the normal range because so many people are pre-diabetic. But if you really want to be healthy, you need a value below 6. So I'm not sure what the American units are. So these would be the units that we use in this country and I think in Britain. And so they're the much lower units, but 2 to 6. So we did some experiments retrospectively in the 1990s, and it was astonishing that if you started exercise with an insulin of 6 or higher, the metabolic response was total opposite to a value below 6. So 6 is this magical cutoff. Below that, if you're eating that diet, you're going to lose weight and become healthy. If it's 6 or up, you're either not going to lose weight or you're going to gain weight. So that's what I would like to suggest. It's very low values, and there's a tiny proportion of the population that have those values, and most of those people will be on the low-carb diet. It's almost impossible to get those low values unless you're eating 25 to 50 grams of carbs a day.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Janice, for that question. The next question is from John. Is carbohydrate intolerance behind hearing loss in the elderly?
I think it is, because we know that carbohydrate intolerance is a key driver of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and they're all called type 3 diabetes now. So instead of being type 1 and type 2, we've got a type 3 diabetes, which is the dementia that occurs in elderly people. So your brain is incredibly sensitive to insulin and glucose. And so I would suggest that if you've got high insulin levels, high glucose levels, you're going to affect your brain, and it could affect any area of the brain, and hearing loss could be one of them. Tragically, one of my great friends from high school developed type 1 diabetes I think in grade 8 or grade 9. And so he was on insulin all his life, and he was the first person in our group whom I know of who developed a dementia, a very serious dementia. And I can only think that was because he was well treated on insulin. And unfortunately, he didn't know about the low-carb diet. He eventually did adopt the low-carb diet, but only after the dementia had developed. So yes, I would think so. And tinnitus is considered to be a marker of insulin resistance. And I certainly have tinnitus. I haven't actually got it at the moment when I think about it. But I've had tinnitus for forever. And it has tended to get better since I've been on this diet. It hasn't gone completely. But I would think that was a consequence of my diabetes.
That is so interesting, Prof, because I want to say my younger years, I've also struggled with it.
Yeah.
And I just thought it went away by itself.
Yeah, no.
But like you said, it might have been, something to do with my diet that changed. That's very interesting. Thank you for that answer and thank you for that question. The next question is from Jedi Jim. Hi, Prof. I know you have ran many marathons, but I'm guessing you were still a high carber back then. Have you ran any marathons now that you are on keto?
So, Jenny, the best race I ever ran was before I got onto these high carb diets. And I always had problems with hypoglycemia, which I didn't recognize until it was too late. And only later on did I realize that the high carb diet that I ate had dramatically bad effects on my running. So my best runs were when I was eating a conventional diet before I graduated as a doctor and was told, because I was working in a cardiology unit, that I had to eat a high carbohydrate diet. So retrospectively, I did much better, but substantially better on the carnivore or diet. I was raised on the carnivore diet. My parents were from Zimbabwe, and there was no processed foods in Zimbabwe when I was born. And my mother her father had been in the meat industry in Britain, and she believed fish and meat were very good for one, and eggs and dairy, and that's what she raised me on. And I was at only my own stupidity when I got into studying hearts and cardiology that I was influenced by the professors who were teaching me, and I assumed they knew everything. Only later did I learn that they got it all wrong. So I have run half marathons on this diet and did fine, but now I'm not able to run that far anymore. I'm now turning 75 this year, and unfortunately, at this age, it gets more and more difficult to run those marathons. And I'm focusing on CrossFit, and I don't eat any carbs and do fine on CrossFit, which is an explosive sport. It's not an endurance sport. So, but to answer your question, we've now done 3 trials of high carb versus low carb diets in the same athletes, and we find that the diet, pre-exercise diet, is meaningless. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter whether you're high fat or high carbs, your performance is the same. And unfortunately, again, industry has convinced us that it's only the high carb diet that works. And they've had free reign for 40 years. But the relationship between performance and carbohydrate diets is purely associational. And we're the first people to tackle it properly and in a systematic way. Ourselves and people like Daniel Plews, who I've mentioned earlier, we're the only ones who tackled it and systematically, and we can't find any evidence that the high carb diet makes any difference, that improves your performance. So my conclusion is that the story of diet is completely wrong. You can eat what you like. If it's nutritious, I mean, not suggesting you go and eat a non-nutritious diet, but how much carbs and how much fat it contains is irrelevant for your performance. I still believe that there are benefits to the high-fat diet for performance, but they will only come apparent when you exercise for very much longer, 4, 5, 6 hours. But the health benefits, I think, are very clear. There's no question in my mind, as we describe in the textbook, that the high-fat diet is far more healthy for you, because that's what we humans evolved to eat, or if you prefer, that's what God designed us to eat.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for that question. Before we go on to the next question, I just want to make everyone aware that at 2 o'clock, we have load shedding here, Prof. Yeah. So we're going to continue till then, but if by any chance the line cuts off or something happens, just know we are experiencing load shedding. So just in a nutshell, what that is, at the moment in South Africa, there's not enough electricity for everyone. So we take turns having electricity. The next question, Prof, is from Heather. And she is saying, as a diabetic who had used no control for years using food to medicate, I'm now using a sugar meter and it has transformed my accountability. I have reduced basal insulin from 64 to 38, lost 20 kilograms, and try to keep my carb intake to 20 to 30 grams daily, eating high fat, medium protein, and low carb using protein and salad or veg. I have now plateaued and would like to move beyond where I find myself. I have begun with intermittent fasting, which I don't find easy, but I'm doing it by now eating one meal every 24 hours. My question is, how do I reduce my basal insulin to 0? Do I do a few days of fasting on a regular basis, or do not want any hypos, which can happen during the night, that defeats the object to then having to eat something sweet or regulate my sugar level? I'm a type 2 diabetic, so my old lifestyle has done damage. Is this damage permanent, or do I have to live a fasted life? I do have another 20 to 15 kilograms to drop, so will my insulin usage drop drastically also? Do I just need to be patient and keep going? I am so very insulin resistant, and even when fasting, I wake with lower sugars, but then they go into double digits. Some advice from the pro would be a gift, as I find living in the UK with diabetic guidance from the NHS advocates to eat carbs and even have naughty foods like biscuits with coffee in the afternoon, and I understand this to be a rabbit hole. I'm scoffed at when I am honest about the route I'm taking. Many thanks.
Sure, because hypoglycemia is not common in type 2 diabetics. So that I would like to investigate more thoroughly. Why are you developing hypoglycemia? I mean, I've never been hypoglycemic. I can't do it. And despite the fact that I also eat a very low carbohydrate diet. So something is happening that's turning off your liver glucose production. And that's interesting because that's what you want. I think a lot of diabetes is because the liver continues to overproduce glucose under the action of the hormone glucagon. And normally glucagon is inhibited by insulin, but part of insulin resistance, and I think the most important component of insulin resistance, is that insulin doesn't inhibit glucagon production. So you get an excessive glucagon production at all times. And that then causes you to have always be overproducing glucose. So I think that you need to say, what are your goals? Do you want to control your diabetes and that you're doing it rather well? You're concerned that you've got excess weight. The only way I know that you can continue to lose weight is to increase your protein intake. That then is more satiating, and maybe cut your fat intake a little bit. But you're very concerned and you're very careful in what you do. Ultimately, you might want to go on a much higher protein diet, but that's very difficult. You mentioned it's difficult fasting. It's also difficult eating a higher protein diet because most of the protein that we eat comes with fat, and so that it's difficult to eat a high protein diet without also getting lots of fat. So I think you're moving in the right direction. You're at much lower risk of getting diabetic complications if you ever do get them. And I think that you should continue the way you are doing it. You'll never reverse and become normal. I will never reverse my diabetes. I will always need metformin, will always need to eat almost zero carbohydrate per day because of this other problem that I have. I think we have the glucagon effect. In your case, you don't seem to have that glucagon effect because your liver's not producing the glucose when it needs to at night. I would investigate what's going on with that and see if you can explain that. And there may be other medications. You might be actually taking too much metformin. That could be the cause, because metformin does reduce the glucose production by the liver. So those are factors. I think you're doing extremely well, but you've got a rare form of diabetes. There are all sorts of different variants. And your form is slightly different, and therefore it needs an expert to help you. I'd be very happy for you to write to me, and I'll see if I can help you, and I'll tell you what I think you should do in stages, and we can see what results you get. But you've done incredibly well so far, so just keep pushing and keep questioning. But you do need to understand why you're becoming hypoglycemic at night. That is extremely unusual.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Heather, for that question. I will just ask our media team to pop it there in the comment box, but you can write to us at info@thenoakesfoundation.org, and we will make sure, Prof, that you get her email. So I think we have to say goodbye, unfortunately. I know we did not get to all of the questions today. We will keep all of them, and we will start with them next time when we do the live, Prof. But thank you, everyone, again for joining. Thank you for all of the engagement. So many incredible questions, so many incredibly interesting answers, Prof. Thank you for also, giving your time to us and to everyone else. We really appreciate it. Keep an eye on our Facebook page, as we are now doing regular weekly lives. We're inviting other people to join us. If you have anyone that you would like for us to interview, or if you want to suggest anyone, let us know. Or if you want to come up and have a live with us, we're happy to accommodate that. So yeah, everyone, I hope you have a lovely day further, and thank you again, and thank you, Prof.
Thanks, Jana. Thanks, everyone. Fantastic questions. Much appreciated. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but next time we promise hopefully we can do a 2-hour session.
Yes.
And then we'll be able to do all of them.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Now I have to quickly figure out how do I end the live, everyone, because we're now still looking at you all. Oh, there we go. It's hiding here in the corner. Okay, bye.
Bye.